All right, well, I'm going to go ahead and kick it off for this evening. My name is Allison Salutes, and I work at Historic Denver. And my partner in crime this evening is Andrea Malcolm, the director of our Molly Brown House Museum. We have been putting together Empowered by Place programs for you guys throughout this year. And tonight we have the exciting opportunity to talk about 9th Street Historical Park. But before we get into that, I'm going to open with a land acknowledgement. We've added this to all our programs to just honor our contested past. So we acknowledge with respect that the land that we are discussing today is the traditional and ancestral homeland of the Arapaho, Cheyenne, and Ute. This was an important site of trade for numerous Native tribes. We recognize the Indigenous people as original stewards of the land, and their descendants still reside here. As these words of acknowledgement are spoken and heard, the historic and present ties these nations have to their traditional homelands are renewed and affirmed. We just always want to make sure that we honor everybody who came before, and that's going to be an important piece, especially I think in our program this evening. Then switching gears a little bit, we also kind of want to say thanks to the SCFD, who helps fund a lot of our programs, and to help us at the end of this year accurately report who attended our programs. We're going to launch a quick poll here and ask you guys to weigh in. Just tell us where you're from, and that will help secure funding in the future from the SCFD. All right, so I'll give just a second for those polls to be completed. All right. So we, this year, we're celebrating Historic Denver's 50th anniversary. And so one of our goals with the programs that we are looking at is just thinking about some of the projects that really started in the early 1970s when Historic Denver was founded. Obviously, first and foremost, we saved the Molly Brown House, which we still actively own and operate today. But we were incredibly involved in the 9th Street Historic Park project. And so that is, that's what we wanted to talk about this evening. We'll get into its history because there's a lot of ups and downs. This is really coming on the heels of some other pieces of kind of the change that we saw in Denver in the 60s. So the Skyline project really set the stage for like some of what's happening here. And then to help us kind of talk through this, our program tonight, we've got Gregorio Alcaro, and he's going to share with us his family history, a history about Auraria. Andrea is going to help fill us in on some of Historic Denver's pieces with us. And then at the very end of the program, we're going to talk about a newer initiative from the city that kind of helps neighborhood equity. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and introduce Gregorio Alcaro. He's a historian and architect who runs the Auraria Casa Mayan Heritage, which is a nonprofit he co-founded in 2007. The nonprofit works to reconnect Denver's West Side and create a community, cultural, and historical preservation center through educational tours, historical research, community workshops, exhibits, multimedia events, art, music, architecture, and urban design. Gregorio's family lived in Auraria from the 1910s until the displacement in 1974. And he recalls walking around with his mother in Auraria, meeting families, business owners. So he really, he was young, but very young, right, Gregorio? But he really witnessed firsthand the changes in the community, which is really some of the topic that we're discussing this evening. As a film director and storyboard artist, he's currently completing a television screenplay miniseries drama about the legendary Casa Mayan. In 2018, Historic Denver actually honored Gregorio with our Ann Love Award, which is designed for non-traditional initiatives, creativity, and commitment in preserving Denver cultural and architectural history. It's kind of a funny, fancy way of saying someone who has done a lot of preservation, but maybe that wasn't their main goal. But they did it kind of as they were working on all their other goals. And then I was also going to share that in 2020, Gregorio's grandmother, Carolina Gonzalez, was inducted into the Colorado Women's Hall of Fame for her humanitarian, cultural, and business accomplishments, making her only the second Mexican American in the historical category. So that's also kind of a very interesting piece of history there. So with that, I am going to hand it over to Gregorio. You will give me 1 second. I'm going to switch the screen to Gregorio's presentation. Sorry about that. Always think I have it. And then, of course, I need an extra minute. There we go. This should work this time. All right, I think we're in business. All right, so I'll hand it over to you, Gregorio.
Thank you, Allison. Welcome, everybody. I'm very honored to be part of this. We're living in very interesting times in Denver, where I believe a lot of the history and the culture of our past are going to have some relevance in our future. So thank you. I'm going to break the talk in 5 parts, covering early Auraria, what made it, how it developed, and the spatial layouts of our neighborhood, the architectural layouts, and the social and cultural forces that actually made it very distinct from Denver. And then I'm going to use my grandparents' home, which is located on 9th Street Historic Park. It is just 1 block north of Colfax. It is the oldest remaining house in Denver, built in 1872. And I'm going to use that house as a microcosm of what Auraria was and what it could be, and perhaps inspire other neighborhoods as to preserve their culture, their history, their heritage, and ask questions about urban design. I will also briefly talk about the displacement of our community, a general overview of Denver urban renewal philosophy and what happened from the 50s to the 70s, and then end up with the future of the campus and potentials for redefining and protecting our neighborhoods today. So as Allison has given an acknowledgement, we have here a painting of early Auraria, an interpretation of what it would have looked like around 1859. Auraria is where our city, Denver, began. It was the confluence of the Platte River and the Cherry Creek coming together. And when prospectors found deposits of gold, they started laying out the city. To the east bank, Denver, and to the west bank, Auraria. And that was some contentious times until 1860, when it emerged as one city called Denver. But for many years, the area west of Cherry Creek from the confluence to Alameda was known as the west side of Denver. You know, we've given some acknowledgement to the indigenous peoples. Before the discovery of gold in 1858, though, there was early trade at the confluence with the French, the fur trade from 1850 and 1845. And the route along Cherry Creek became a trade route that later became a stagecoach route, which allowed Denver to have the upper hand as what part of this area was going to be the major commerce center, and later the capital of this area known as Denver. So that's a general overview, but I would like to, you know, we're going to be talking about displacements. We talked about the indigenous people, and we had a community later on displaced from the mid 1870s to the 1970s. But I would like to take time to recognize that we had an earlier displacement of non-human settlements, and this was the ecology. The Cherry Creek was very different type of water system compared to the Platte River. The Platte was a steady body of water. The Cherry Creek had periodic droughts. They originated differently. They had different drought periods and flood periods. And in between these two rivers was a very rich ecology because of the deposits and the buffalo, the deer, the moose, and along Cherry Creek, which is named Cherry Creek because we had an abundance of indigenous plants, the chokecherry, which was very important to the, not only later on with the indigenous people, but it was important to the animal, the ecology that we have lost. The cottonwood trees along Cherry Creek, which are no longer, and Platte. So we did lose an ecosystem, and that's very important to recognize the role water has played in the West and how it continues to play. And when we have discussions on sustainability, the use of water, landscape architecture, we need to go back and understand just exactly where we are in our map here, where we are in our geography. So the chokecherry, for instance, was very important in healing, internal, external healing and nourishment for many years. I would like to move forward to the distinctions between, probably the next slide. This is an example of the flood of 1864. It's important to realize here, when that building in the middle of the sandbar didn't believe that there would be any water, since there was a period of drought when a lot of these settlers came in here. And this is an example of early unawareness of ecology, the systems, and the importance flood has played in replenishing our ecosystems, our wetlands, and so forth. This is an attitude of that, you know, we're still dealing with, is what role does water play, and do we control it, or do we learn about its system in a natural way? This is 1864 looking into Auraria. And next slide. This is an example of the use of water in the development of our community. I would go back and say that, first of all, Auraria defined by the two rivers, which is currently the confluence, and today would be Colfax. It would have probably gone further south to 8th Avenue. But that defined what we know as Auraria and what is currently the Auraria campus today, which is approximately 200 acres. But this is an example how in the beginnings of early Denver, that the use of water was used through our parks. This is going from the Platte along 8th Avenue through the La Alma, Lincoln Park, and continued through Auraria down to the confluence. It was used for many purposes, and also to power the mills that we had, the flour mills and so forth. This is no longer, but it's important to recognize the role of water. I would now, let's say, move forward. Next slide. This is an example, an 1880 map. You can see the growth patterns. On the bottom right is Auraria. To the left is Denver in 1880. And on the top of the map, you can see the layout of the future Denver. These are three distinct grid systems that we now use, the one which is a north-south, but early Auraria was laid out according to the waterways, how important water was in defining our community. And that's why we have three different grid systems. If you go around Denver and get a little confused in this intersection. Next slide. This is an example. This is my family. I'm going to express how the Mexican people during the Civil War of 1910, the Mexican Revolution, migrated north. My family had several stops before they stopped in Auraria in 1918. They traveled by motor car, whereas a lot of the immigrants from the South used the railroad as transportation. And a lot of the Mexican-American communities we see here in Denver and even places like Chicago and Kansas were a result of railroad stops. And that's why we have those distinct communities there. We had over 1 million people migrate during that revolutionary period. And then see the next slide. So I'm going to talk about the unique, this is Auraria in the 70s, early 70s, before the demolition, looking north. And I'd like to briefly talk about what made our community distinct from Denver. Architecturally and socially, Auraria was an instant city, you can say an instant neighborhood. It did not have time with the influx of immigrants to have the various ethnic and racial groups segregate themselves. So you had this mixture of different ethnic groups living next to each other. You didn't have the segregation of the Italians or the Asians or the Mexicans or Jewish. That was a very important feature. We had like many cities before the 1880s and zoning, we had a mixed use. We had light industry, warehouses, commercial, residential, educational, and religious mixed together. They were not separated out. And that's very distinct with Auraria, particularly the religious and educational institutions mixed in with the light industry. For example, in parts of Auraria, in the center of Auraria, you could walk within a 2-block radius, 2-block half radius, and you could walk to your work. You had walked to 8 different religious institutions and 5 educational institutions. We were very distinct from Denver. When you crossed Cherry Creek, you had different mixed building uses. You can call us more of a humanitarian center district, if that was a term we can use today. We did not have the gambling, we did not have the prostitution, we did not have banks and some of the types of commercials you had businesses across the creek. And this division continued to play a part for 100 years until 1969 when there was a vote to bring in the campus. So because of this separation of uses and character, those issues played a part in the displacement of over 300 families and 200 businesses, and how the campus was laid out, and what is going on as I speak today. I'd like to, if you have any questions, I'd like to just, if you could remind me or ask, what does this have to do with today? Well, it does have an issue. A lot of the issues 50 years ago, based on this grid system and usage, are still being addressed today. The campus is trying to find identity, how do they can engage with the surrounding communities, etc. Briefly, let me explain some of the other distinct characteristics. We had a system called a circular economy. We produced goods that were sold outside of Auraria and were sold into Auraria. And sometimes those services, people would share those services. If it was using the yeast from the bread company to, use for beer making, or like my family, the printers, helping to make the menus, etc. We actually worked supported each other. We were a multi-ethnic community. We were a musical community. You might want to move this next slide, please. This is Auraria taken in 1972. Let's see. The upper left would be where the Pepsi Center is now. And then the next slide. And that shows what it looks like today. To give you an example, very few of the 36 square blocks, only 1 block has remained of the residential, which is on the lower right. You can see Casa Mayan. And next slide. This is an example of, besides, I'm going to go back, we also bartered in our community. If we had services, we would have an economy where we can barter services. This is an example of an organic local farmers market from Colfax to Lawrence Street. For half a century, this was an important part of our community. To the right, you can see Cherry Creek before it was a two-way thoroughfare. The next slide, please. This is my grandmother, Carolina Gonzalez, who lived in Auraria from 1918 to 1974, the last person to be displaced. Next slide. That's her. She has been inducted into the Colorado Women's Hall of Fame, particularly how she used her home to the benefit of other people and the pioneer usages of her home, which has a lot to do with what is allowed today and what you can use in your community, etc. Next slide. As I said, we were a musical community, multi-ethnic, musical, multi-generational. And this is important to know when we deal with how the separation of age uses today by architects with senior housing or gated communities. We didn't have that back in Auraria, and there were some benefits to that. Next slide, please. This is example of the Mexican American population. This is my family. One-fourth of Mexican Americans congregated into Auraria for the September 16th celebration. It was the gathering place. They performed at the Tivoli Turn Hall, run by the German community, one of the only few places that Mexican Americans were allowed to rent. So we had an incredible amount of tolerance in the ethnic tolerance in this community: Jewish, Irish, Mexican, English, Scottish, Puerto Rican, German. I forget if I missed another group. Briefly, while we're at it here, this was taken in 1927. As I said, about 10,000 Mexicans would congregate to celebrate their culture. To the left, I just want to acknowledge this is my Aunt Belen. This was her funeral today. So she was the oldest remaining Aurarian at an age of 102. And she was a pioneer in teaching dance, and 65 years at the Denver Public Library in research, called the Bibliographical Research Center, which was before the internet. So I just like to pay tribute to our oldest and remaining Auraria, or who passed away. Next slide, please. This is an example of, I'd like to get into the architecture of our community. This is 9th Street Historic Park. To the left is my grandparents' home, known as Casa Mayan. We had an interesting layout of the streets. We had 2 trolley cars to the left, to the right. We were a walkable community. We did not have to have cars. We can walk to so many, whether it's stores or businesses, church, schools. We had this 18-foot easement, as you can see where this tree is, wonderful for kids, a 5-foot flagstone sidewalk, and as you transition to the left, porches. Porches were a very important part in daily contact with our community. And so you have this wonderful layout here of a transition between public space and private space. And I could get in further if you have any questions about how important the porch was and the interior architecture. This is also, I'd like to acknowledge the 9th Street as a major thoroughfare for cultural usage, not necessarily automobile, but culture. People would come from Alamo, Lincoln Park to St. Cajetan's. The Irish would also come down the street. What we had here was a constant reminder of the cycles of life, births, baptisms, weddings and funerals between the different ethnic groups, and processionals. If you use the next slide, please. Example of processionals, how cultures use space down these thoroughfares. I bring this up because architects today and planners do not have in sometimes their programming, what is cultural? What is cultural use of space? It's not just a museum, it's how different ethnic groups or people use space. And that goes back to the indigenous people. So I'd like to bring that up. Next slide, please. Here's an example of a 500-year-old tradition called Las Posadas. This is taken in Lincoln Park, Mariposa Street, going down to Casa Mayan. Different ethnic groups participated in the recreation of the biblical account of Mary and Joseph asking for shelter. In this case, it's used to promote the fighting against homelessness and housing issues. So taking an old tradition and using it to address current architectural and political issues in Denver. Next slide. I'd like to jump into the characteristics of the Gonzalez medley house known as Casa Mayan. This is important because it deals with the freedom to expand and create your space, the freedom to preserve your heritage, your culture. Next slide. This is the beginnings of the oldest house in Denver, remaining house in Denver. It was on the edge of a prairie built by a Quaker dentist and his family. We had our first Quaker services here. And what you see here is because of the multi-generational use and other uses is that you had the freedom to add on to your house. And this was typical. This is the adding on to another living room, a kitchen, and then in the back was a carriage house. And 9th Street Park currently does not have the reconstruction of our backyards, which are very important social expressions of how the space was used. This carriage house became the nucleus of the cultural events at Casa Mayan. That's the building to the left. Next slide, please. Okay, early Smedley House, 1872. The additions made, kitchen. Next slide, please. Okay, 1880. So it continues on to grow and grow up until the 1910s. Next slide, please. Until you have this wonderful courtyard, which was very important to our community. We had a very distinct Mexican-American community, and like the Gonzalez family, they did not assimilate. They preserved their language, their food, and music, yet this is a beautiful example of shared space. This house was used for Irish cultural events. We had many Irish live here, many Irish families, weddings, wakes and dances, and sometimes the Irish would marry Mexicans, and so we call those that married Mexicans and had kids, we call them leprechanos, in acknowledge of this Mexican-Irish solidarity here. Next slide. Okay, next. Okay, so this house eventually evolved into amazing eclectic uses for Irish wakes and cultural events, dance studios, art studios, clubs, a blacksmith usage, artisans, and so forth, furniture making, etc. Very eclectic use. Next slide. Okay. This unfortunately was torn down because at the time Historic Denver did not have the funds to save it. But the foundation is still there. Perhaps we can recreate it. Next slide. And this was the outdoor dining of Casa Mayan. I'm going to jump in the Casa Mayan because time is flying by much faster than I realized here. My family purchased this house. My grandmother purchased this house in 1933. Next slide. And upon purchasing this house during the Great Depression, my grandmother and grandfather brought a tradition called hospitality, generosity, converting their house. Besides having 30 people live in the house, they opened it up to a sewing school with the Red Cross. Next slide. Okay, next slide. And at the same time, there during the Great Depression, it's estimated we had about 250,000 homeless boys and families ride the rails illegally. These are from the Midwest, by the way. And at the middle of the bottom, you see the sign, the symbols. These were hobo language to mark places where they can get work, barter for work and food and shelter. And they marked the Casa Mayan as a place to stop on by. And this was one of the first examples of cultural exchange between non-Mexicans and Mexicans in learning about food and culture. Next slide. It was also a cultural center for my grandfather, bringing people to play chess, including during World War II, generals and soldiers to gather there during World War II. Next slide. Okay, next slide. So my family were musical. When they opened the house, they were serving students and faculty before there was a campus, and this evolved into a restaurant. And everything was handmade, and new foods were introduced, and they had to push with the city to allow foods today that are very common that were considered unsafe, or they didn't know how to, for instance, tamales, using corn husks, they were told they had to use white paper. And so there was a lot of education that we had to teach the city people about Mexican food, and including outdoor dining. They introduced outdoor dining to Denver, which was not allowed prior to the Casa Mayan. So they were pioneers in changing our use of space. And by the way, they worked downstairs, they lived upstairs in the back until 1974, mixed use. Yeah, next slide. It's the front of Casa Mayan, opened in 1946. Next slide. And we had an incredible mixture of the very poor, the very rich. We had African Americans, Jewish, Irish. The Casa Mayan bridged a lot of social economic barriers when there was a lot of divisiveness. And this barrio, this working class neighborhood, just to show you the rich culture that we had. Here's President Truman at the Casa Mayan in 1948 to have a taste of Mexican food at my grandmother's house. Next slide. We had artisans, poets, writers from all over the world congregate in the home. An incredible mixture of people. Next slide. And I'm going to jump into now the short time here about Denver urban renewal and its effects on Auraria and city of Denver. Urban renewal and Auraria were like a confluence. We had two different philosophies. Auraria was really separated from Denver in terms of needing government help. We helped each other through the churches and through places like Casa Mayan and families, where in some ways we had our own politics, a sustaining community that wasn't engaged so much in what was going on in Denver. Consequently, after World War II, when there was a need for housing and the push for highways and higher education, Auraria was viewed as a place for the planning department and the government. But unfortunately, a lot of the community members were not aware of these plans. Next slide, please. Including a highway that would have ran through what is now Lodo and Rhino. So what we have today is distinctly part of the old history of Denver's Larmer Square, and the baseball field would have been a highway. Next slide. This is going through, you can see to the upper right, upper left, the Rocky Stadium, and what would have been destroyed if this Skyline Highway, which was proposed in the mid-60s until 1969, was very close for being built. Next slide, please. Okay, next. This is Casa Mayan in 1974, before its closure. Denver urban renewal, after the flood of 65, in conjunction with the need for higher education, partnered with the three institutions to select a site. Auraria was selected in 1967. The community was not aware of this. There was a vote taken in 1969 to have federal grant money given for higher education, but it was never discussed about displacement. It was called Higher Education Center and funding, not the removal of 350 families and 200 businesses. This led to protests and organizing to say what could be saved. At the same time, Historic Denver noticed that later, after the vote, we lost the vote, that there was historic significance in these homes and churches and buildings. And they proposed at the before the bulldozers came in, it was a miracle to save one block. And next slide, please. Okay, next. They, in a short period of time, a miracle of 9th Street, Historic Denver, with the use of no government funding, private funding, even though our families and businesses were displaced, saved the oldest part of Denver's homes. And this is the opening in 1976 with my family visiting. This park had visions to expand down to the Tivoli, and it was going to be used as an educational laboratory for preservation. But since 1976, it's been used for offices. This was given to the city, the state of Denver education, to be used for offices and so forth. But we are proposing that this be reopened to the community, and the history is re-evaluated to celebrate the rich diversity. Next slide, please. From 76 to 2016, the house has been used for offices, and with the help of professors and community groups and our organization, we are proposing that we can have a cultural center restored back to this historic house and acknowledge the rich history. This is chess games that took place, some art exhibits. These are students at the upper left. Next slide, please. This is an example of using these spaces for performing arts, history classes, architectural classes. We're only one block from Colfax, by the way, for those that haven't visited the park. This is taken just one block north, or looking one block south, I should say. So it's 3 acres, and I believe our next speaker will address some of the history. And next slide. We are proposing a museum that honors the people who lived in Auraria, the different ethnic groups, and exhibits. We are proposing a cafe that could be opened to allow those people who were displaced to come back and have a non-institutional run historic gathering place to celebrate our rich history. Next slide. Okay. Next slide. So we have been giving tours and so forth, but I'm bringing this up because we have a park here that is, we have a lot of unfinished business here. You know, we're going back 100 years and so forth. And this is relevant because right across the street, we have a Alamo Lincoln Park district that is proposing to preserve its history and heritage through a national historic district. And this has opportunities for us to connect the two neighborhoods, to start preserving our open space, to start having more trees and parks, and treating this as a healthy community, not just in its architecture and culture, but it's going back to our environmental roots. Next slide. And this is Casa Mayan. Next year will be 150th birthday party, the oldest house in Denver, built in 1872. Next slide. And this is an example. To the left, in the middle of the screen, is Colfax. To the left is La Alma Lincoln Park. You can see the green belt there, and the homes, many of those homes in the historic district proposal that City Council will vote on. We have the campus. You can see Casa Mayan with the yellow dot. And we have our theater district, our hotels, Larmer Square, 14th Street at the bottom right. So we have 3 distinct communities, and we are addressing how we can connect these communities now, after all these years, and see how we can help each other as partners with private, with government, with homes, and with nonprofits, educational, collaborating to make this a more walkable, more accessible community in this area. That was very quick. I know there's a lot to talk about. If any questions, or I know at the end there will be opportunity for questions, but I went through this very fast, but I'd be glad to if anybody has questions now.
Yeah, thank you so much, Gregorio. I think that was such a wonderful overview. And yes, if you folks have questions, if you want to park them in the chat, I can relay them to Gregorio. Or if you are more comfortable unmuting yourself and asking directly, feel free. We have a few minutes for questions here before we move into Andrea's piece. Let's see. Maybe no questions right away, Gregorio. But just to keep the program moving along, let's keep parking those in the chat. We'll have another moment to ask Gregorio any questions that we have about his presentation, his family, and the history of Auraria. And then we're going to give Andrea the opportunity to share a little bit about kind of that next piece of history and how historic Denver and 9th Street kind of became inextricably linked.
While you're bringing that up, Allison, I'll go ahead and introduce myself again. I'm Andrea Malcolm, Director of Historic Denver's Molly Brown House Museum. As Gregorio said, the removal of the entire Auraria neighborhood happened, as the effort to create the Auraria Higher Education Center came about. This was happening in spite of the fact that a new local layer of protection for historic buildings had been added with the 1967 Denver Preservation Ordinance, which was in a direct reaction to the Skyline Renewal Project. Was that Skyline Highway that was going to raise 26 blocks in the core of downtown. So this ordinance created a policy framework that supported the creation of historic districts and the designation of landmarks, and all to be overseen by the new Landmarks Preservation Commission. We can still see Skyline Park in the news today as the city, Downtown Denver Partnership, and dozens of stakeholders are working towards a new site plan, which they should be releasing later this summer. And this ordinance also came 3 years after Larimer Square Incorporated was formed by Dana Crawford to purchase and renovate the 1400 block of Larimer Street. So Crawford really wanted to enhance the city's overall downtown development strategy. And even though she faced some pretty stiff opposition, she ultimately sought historic designation for Larimer Square after the formation of the LPC, creating Historic District #1, and really set the guidelines and standards for the rest of lower downtown. And this was all unfolding as Historic Denver was founded in 1970 to save the Molly Brown House. And this group included Crawford, of course, Jim Judd, Joanne Dittmer, Ken Watson, and Don Etter, among others, who quickly realized that they could advocate on behalf of properties and neighborhoods around the city. And they lent their grassroots moxie to such places as the Tramway Building, which we know is the Spaghetti Factory, 4 Mile Historic Park, the Moffett Mansion, Murat Cabin, Sheedy House, and Richtofen Castle. And of course, most of those were successful, but not all of them, obviously. Next slide, Allison. In 1972, Don Etter and Ken Watson, Historic Denver trustees, proposed that the 1000 block of 9th Street be preserved, with its buildings converted into eventually campus administrative offices, and the street itself turned into a greenway or park. Historic Denver appealed to the Auraria Board, which approved the 9th Street Preservation Plan. Denver Urban Renewal objected, arguing that it was far too late in the process for such a major alteration to the redevelopment plan. But Historic Denver prevailed, and they were able to mobilize an increasingly preservation-minded citizenry. And by 1973, Historic Denver was underway, helping to stabilize structures and create an eventual plan for 9th Street. They were all working off of HD board trustee member Don Etter's book called Auraria, where he had already documented many of the houses found in the neighborhood. So Historic Denver, in agreement with the Colorado Commission on Higher Education, received possession of the houses and the adjacent properties for the purpose of renovating the insides and restoring the exteriors. The agreement with the state read, however, that any of the identified properties not renovated by the last day of 1975 must be demolished at the expense of Historic Denver. So with the time clock crunching, they set an ambitious goal to complete one house a month in order to complete the deadline. Next slide, Allison. So funds for the project came from not only the Betcher Foundation, the Gates Foundation, and even an anonymous donor who gave $100,000. There was also $30,000 in funds from the National Park Service and National Endowment for the Arts. And then Historic Denver created an annual fundraiser called Night in Old Denver, which raised $30,000 each year it was held. So by early 1975, Historic Denver had already spent over $250,000 on the park. While you see on this budget plan that breaks down each address and then breaks down each expense category for that address, you can see that expected total costs for the sites were going to be just under $775,000. The actual cost of the project exceeded $900,000, and 14 buildings were saved, becoming the oldest surviving residential block in Denver. Historic Denver, as Gregorio said, gifted this back to the state in a ceremony that was held on August 1st, 1976. So just in time for Colorado Day and the big bicentennial. Allison, I'm gonna share screen if you don't mind, and I'm gonna pull up another great document that we had in our archives that actually was produced for this, for this event specifically on August 1st to dedicate the 9th Street Historic Park. And then we can explore some of the properties. So the Denver Municipal Band played at this dedication, and then you can see people such as Barbara Sudler, who was with Historic Denver, the Honorable Richard Lamb, who was governor at the time, and even Thomas Hornsby Farrell, Colorado Centennial and Bicentennial poet, was on hand for the ceremony. This great booklet has a brief history, and there we have the Casa Mayan house right there as the first house featured in this project booklet. These are the Jeremiah Gardner and the house next door. He was a carpenter, and you can see some of the fine details that he lent to those houses. There was also the Davis House at 1068 9th Street, which is an Italianate villa built in 1873 by Charles Davis, who was the first miller in the city, and originally owned, just like Gregorio said, those flour mills. He owned roller flour mills, and later that became Eagle Flour. There was also the Wilson or Centennial House at 1050, which was built in 1876 by Frank Wilson. Part of the structure at Historic Denver believes though dated back to 1865. Wilson was a member of the Brotherhood of Locomotive Engineers and well loved in his community, and this being one of the earliest brick houses in the city. And then both 1033 and 1027, as I said, had Jeremiah Gardner's carpenter touches. And then 1061 9th Street was one of the properties owned by J.K. Mullen, a name you might be familiar with, who was head of the Hungarian flour mill. He had also lived at 1043 and 1061, and those are all nearly identical to 1068 9th Street. And 1024, which is the Roop House, built for Oscar Roop, who came west from Ohio to drive an ox train to Colorado. So all of these houses contain all of these amazing stories. And then of course, there's the block's one commercial structure remaining, which is the Grousman store, which was built in 1901. So this was a treasure to find in our archives with the work that we were able to do on 9th Street and celebrate preserving intact at least a part of this Denver neighborhood. So I'm going to stop sharing, Allison. So adjacent to the park, you can also see the Korngold House, once the home of Israeli Prime Minister Golda Meir. It had been moved to the campus in 1988 to help preserve it. And then, as Gregorio said, there were so many religious centers in the Auraria neighborhood. Today, you can still see St. Cajetan's further east, Temple Emmanuel, and then St. Elizabeth's as well. You can go to the next slide. We encourage you, of course, to wander around yourself. Here's the site plan for Ninth Street Historic Park, another piece we had in our archives. You can see the lower right corner, you can see 1020, which is Casa Mayan, and then sort of down below that, Marat Cabin, which was a cabin structure that Historic Denver at the time was trying to save as part of this whole project. So you can see the layout here of the park. Next slide, Allison. So here's some more images of in progress work done on some of the houses, some of the demolition, just like Gregorio showed us pictures of, and then some of the houses, the Davis houses in the top left corner. And then you can see some of the Night in Old Denver event photo. You can see that in the upper right as fundraisers to help pay for all of this work. As Gregorio said, Historic Denver funded all of this work primarily through private funding, and then gifted it back to the state to be used as part of the campus. So if you haven't been in person, as I said, we encourage you to take a stroll around 9th Street to see the houses for yourself. You can also explore these sites using our Denver storytrek.org website, where you can listen to some oral stories and things like that. Allison and I were having a good conversation as we were preparing for this event and realizing, you know, there is minimal interpretation on 9th Street campus in the form of signage and things like that. So we often wonder what's next, just as Gregorio says, what's next for 9th Street and how it can be more activated to bring back that community sense and that community flavor for 9th Street and sort of that, bring back the feeling that Auraria had originally. So, and in walking around campus, sort of seeing how it was at one point, as Gregorio said, an amazing walkable, community-centered neighborhood. That's all I had, Miss Allison.
Wonderful. Thank you for that. And if you folks have questions about, you know, Historic Denver's role or kind of how this happened, anything even about the displacement, feel free to pop it in the chat box, because we're happy to talk more about the pieces of this story that are of specific interest to each and every one of you. We did want to talk a little bit about an organization in the city that is a more recent kind of, sorry, a more recent group to come on the scene, and that is the Neighborhood Equity and Stabilization Program. It's often referred to as NEST. It's a city-run program created to preserve the culture and character of neighborhoods experiencing significant change by helping provide longtime businesses and residents opportunities to remain in place. Like I mentioned, it was launched in 2018 to help ensure that substantial economic, social, and cultural benefits of Denver's kind of more recent economic success are available and shared by all residents. And we kind of came across this organization a few times in our research and thought it was fitting, because I think, you know, maybe Gregorio can correct me if I'm speaking out of turn here, but had something like this existed, perhaps we wouldn't end up with the high level of displacement that we found at Auraria. So joining us to talk more about NEST is Kat Jarvis. Kat is the acting director of the program. Prior to her work at NEST, she also had past experience as the director of client relations at Joining Vision and Action, a social change consulting firm. She has 4 years of business development experience and 7 years in the nonprofit sector. She's going to talk a little bit about NEST goals and priorities.
Thank you so much, Allison and Andrea, for having me. This is so exciting, and I feel like I learned so much tonight. I'm gonna try to share my PowerPoint here, and forgive me, the city uses Teams through Microsoft, so I am a Zoom novice, and it might take me a moment here. Are you all seeing the PowerPoint?
We aren't yet.
Oh no. Okay. Let's see. Share. How about now? Okay.
Now we do.
Excellent.
Yes, that looks good.
Excellent. Thank you. Okay. So Nest has a vision of vibrant, innovative, and interconnected communities with the means and opportunities to make a home, get a job, and build a future. We're a division within Denver Economic Development and Opportunity. So it's interesting, you know, we're trying to really make sure that there's equity in that economic development and opportunity. The division was created in 2018 as a mayor's initiative to address involuntary displacement. And in 2020, we finally created a strategic plan, and we wrote a new mission. And that mission is to support neighborhoods experiencing significant change in elevating their voice to determine the future of their community by empowering under-resourced and marginalized residents and businesses. We work in 10 target neighborhoods that you can see on this map with blue stars. I know it's very hard to see. The names of the neighborhoods are quite small, but we work in East Colfax, Elyria, Swansea, Globeville, Montbello, Northeast Park Hill, Sun Valley, Valverde, Villa Park, West Colfax, and Westwood. And in the city, we talk a lot about the inverted L, which you can see along here where these stars are. And these are areas of the city that are experiencing, or where a lot of disparities are seen. But you can see on this map, these dark yellow areas are actually areas where there's a great deal of vulnerability to displacement. And the way that we measure that is based on the Community Planning and Development Department's Blueprint Denver Equity Metrics. So the way that we characterize vulnerability to displacement is by median household income, percent of renters in the area, and the percent of population with less than a bachelor's degree. These indicators are shown to be ideal proxy data for figuring out if an area is going to be vulnerable to displacement. So you can see there are a lot of other areas that we're not working in where we're seeing more pockets that are becoming vulnerable to displacement as the city changes. So, you know, we may at some point expand, we'd really like to. And I think it's really important that we're able to track over time what changes are happening in these neighborhoods so we know where our services are most needed. So I won't read our overarching goals off the slide, but I will just kind of give you our philosophy, our kind of strategy overall. We're a community development focused program that really uses an economic lens in our work. So we're focused on neighborhood stabilization and community support, which is kind of the built environment pieces, right? We're analyzing capital investments that the city is making in neighborhoods to make sure that if a large public investment is going into the area, that we're providing some wraparound services along with that investment so that the people currently living in that neighborhood are able to enjoy that investment once it's there. We know that historic disinvestment has also caused displacement, and so it's really important that we don't want to stop investment into these neighborhoods. What we want to do is ensure that we're doing it in a way that is mindful and intentional and really benefits the people who have been there long term. And then the kind of the green box is the community wealth building and economic mobility piece. And that's really ensuring that small businesses in our target communities are able to stay in their locations and are given equal access to a lot of the economic opportunities that other businesses receive in Denver. And then finally, we have a focus on family well-being and self-sufficiency. And this is our youth programming and our two-generational programming. So ensuring that youth have access to jobs, have access to education, and that families are able to stay in place. And then I sort of break down here how our programming fits into each bucket. So we receive federal funding from HUD in the form of the Community Development Block Grant, and we provide public services with that funding, as well as public facilities and infrastructure. So small businesses who need improvements to their building, maintenance, security systems, et cetera. So really, again, that built environment piece is so important. And then the community wealth building, we have quite a few services for small businesses. We work closely with the Division of Business Development in DEDO, and Nest has its own small business support programs as well, and really focused on minority-owned businesses and micro businesses. So the really, really tiny you know, entrepreneurs to 5 people businesses. And then again, the family well-being and self-sufficiency, our CareerWise program is an apprenticeship program that actually just is in the process of expanding across the entire city. We'll have 12 youth apprentices across 10 city departments starting in August. And it's a 3-year program to really help connect youth with professional jobs. And they start when they're juniors in high school. So it's quite a commitment. If you think about when you were 16 or 17 years old, committing to something for 3 years is quite significant. So we're very excited to have that program growing across the city. And then, as we know, displacement is a really large and complex issue, and our little team of 8 people can only do so much, especially with the number of target communities we have and the growing number of communities experiencing vulnerability to displacement, or displacement pressures is probably a better way to say it. So we coordinate a lot with other agencies across the city. We work closely with the Department of Housing Stability. You know, we're kind of focused on displacement from an economic standpoint, and they're focused on the housing side, purchasing properties to make sure that they're affordable for people, et cetera. And community planning and development, we work with them on ensuring that their plans for neighborhoods are equitable, that they're engaging the right community members. The Department of Transportation and Infrastructure, we work a lot on the capital project side, again, to make sure that everyone is mindful of the unintended consequences of projects in neighborhoods. And the Office of Human Rights and Community Partnerships has a few divisions delivering incredible financial empowerment services and engaging the nonprofit sector. So we work very closely with them as well. And with Denver Human Services, who is really focused on kind of the social vulnerabilities in a lot of the neighborhoods that we're focused on. So that's all that I had planned for this evening. I know I went a little fast. I was a little nervous and I talked very quickly, but I included my contact information here, so you all are welcome to get in touch with me if there are questions, or I'm happy to answer questions now if we have some time.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that, Kat. We do have a little bit of time for questions, so I'll monitor the chat if there's any specific questions for Kat coming through there. I didn't know, it sounds like your team of 8 is working really hard and in very different neighborhoods across the city, but I didn't know if you kind of had like a little success story that you wanted to share with us so we can get a feel for that boots on the ground activity.
Yeah, man, it's been interesting in COVID. So to give a little context, I've been at the city since last April. So I've only worked at the city under COVID. I did oversee last year in 2020 the Nonprofit Emergency Relief Fund grants. And through that grant, we were able to deploy, I think, $3.2 million total to Denver area nonprofits. And we gave priority to organizations that were in our target neighborhoods. We found that a lot of those small nonprofits in our target neighborhoods were really struggling, I mean, just to keep the lights on during COVID. And so we were able to provide some assistance there. That's one example.
Yeah, that's an amazing example.
Yeah, thank you. We also helped, the Department of Housing Stability has the Temporary Rental and Utility Assistance Program. We were able to provide some community navigators who helped get people connected with that program last summer, when there was really a lot of risk of people being evicted from their home.
Yeah, I'm sure that the pandemic has definitely changed. Probably boots on the ground is the wrong word to use, even, because it's more like a virtual assistance, an email brigade.
Yes, absolutely. It's a new world.
Right, definitely. We did have a question come in from Suzanne. How were the career-wise apprentices selected, and what type of apprentices are they going to do?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we're actually in the process of interviewing them. They go through an application process just like a city employee would. We worked with departments to decide, what was going to be the best fit for a career-wise position. So within Nest, we'll have an administrative support position, and we will have a community development representative position. So that person will be working closely with our community outreach staff and really kind of learning the ropes there. And our administrative support will be working with our executive team and their assistants, and really providing those like backbone office supports. But it's department by department. So some departments took existing internships and tailored them to the CareerWise program. CareerWise is an international apprenticeship program. If you look it up, you can get a lot more information, but I believe it's based on a Swiss model. And so they have certain program criteria and things like that the apprentices have to meet. But they have to go through the city process. So they're really learning right from the beginning, kind of how it is to work in the professional world, including interviewing. And we have 2 existing residents right now who are just fantastic. So we have high hopes for the caliber of the interns we'll be getting.
That's awesome. It's true that I was a bit different when I was a junior in high school, but we've worked with a number of high school students, both at Molly Brown and Historic Denver, and they're surprisingly professional as well. So I agree. I think you'll get a wonderful caliber of student through the program.
Absolutely.
I had a question. One of our last programs, we talked about the notion of sort of creating a legacy business program here in Denver, something that sort of helps businesses like the Casa Mayan, for instance, who've been around a long time and mean a lot to our city. We were talking specifically about El Chapultepec. Is that something that sort of Nest looks at in the process, is, the longevity of that business within a neighborhood?
Yeah, that's definitely, so our staff person, Carla Castedo Rivero, who is overseeing our business support programming, that's definitely something she's very invested in. So Nest is very new by city standards, and from 2018 to 2019, it was just one staff person. Irene Aguilar was the director, and it was just her. And so we've really grown and just added and added and added. And so I'm excited to see what we're able to do as far as all of our programs and services. But I definitely think Carla is focused on, you know, those historic businesses that have kind of been the anchor institutions in our target neighborhoods, and making sure that they're able to stay where they are. And so we have not built out a legacy business program or grant program at this point, but I think that's definitely a goal going forward.
Fabulous, thank you.
Yeah, wonderful. We did have a question in the chat for Gregorio, so I might hit one back over to him. Kelly was wondering about your comment about having to work with the city to create new rules and regulations for opening a Mexican restaurant. And so she's asking, did we hear you correctly that officials made people use paper instead of corn husks to make tamales? And so she's just would love to know more about the culinary history of Auraria.
Yes, Mexican food has a rich heritage, nutrition-wise, going back to the foods of Mexico and the Mayans, the corn, the squash, the beans, the chilies. But in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s, city officials were not aware of these foods. So our family introduced these foods to the non-Hispanic community. And so those that were not aware, in charge of the codes and regulations, were very nervous about the preparation of these foods, even though my grandmother, for instance, was a nurse and she was a healer and she had strict health and safety standards. They had to demonstrate and challenge, educate the city about this, not only the safety, but the health of what is now so common today of chilies and preparation of corn. My family introduced the molino, a corn processor, to grind the corn freshly, no preservatives, no additives. This was the time after World War II where they were coming in to small businesses and telling them how they can triple their profits by fillers, additives, preservatives. And we went back to the old traditions of healthy food preparation and had to demonstrate that corn husks were part going back so many, I don't know, thousands of years, perhaps, of the use of corn in the Mexican American people and geography. And we had to educate them that corn husks were safe. And we even had to demonstrate to health scientists and people in the Colorado State University that Mexican food was nutritious and safe. It is extremely nutritious in terms of the balancing of the minerals and carbohydrates and iron and vitamin C, etc. And we had to educate. It seems kind of silly today, but I guess the lesson to be learned is for those new cultures coming in that have food or different herbs that we understand before we impose our code. So we fought that. And so we did allow the use corn husk. In addition, they would not allow outdoor dining. That was a safety issue. So we had to educate. This is bringing back some of the things we mentioned, culture and outdoor dining, of course, in Europe or Spain or parts of Mexico. You know, this was something they brought in, but we had to educate the city of Denver that it was okay to eat outside. And so this is an idea of cultural sensitivity and training. You know, they didn't even have in the area to grow chilies for the local farmers, more the non-Hispanic. So the Mexican family, our family, worked with the Japanese families in their farms to grow the corn. That was in here. Farmers didn't know that use the right corn, the chilies, the mixtures of chilies, and so forth. And so we worked with the two minority groups to restore and bring food at a time where, you know, like I said, the junk food was taking over and mass franchises and fast food, etc. So yes, it was a battle, and the lesson to be learned there is is to understand the cultural history of these people and by these minorities, what they bring in terms of use of space, food, and music. In regards to the Irish, we have a wonderful history of Irish-Mexican solidarity going back to the 1848 Mexican-American War, the San Patricios, Americans, Irish who refused to fight against the Mexicans in the fight of the land issues. But there's a wonderful relation with the work ethic, the working class throughout history. And we celebrate, we want to bring the Leprechauno Day, celebrating Mexican-Irish solidarity. But for Auraria, it had a lot to do with the Irish immigrants coming in to live next to Mexicans without time to segregating. We had a wonderful church called St. Leo's Catholic Church across Casa Mayan. For 75 years, it served 4 generations of Irish, 2,500 parishioners, Irish activists and nationalists to try to separate from England. And this all happened within the Mexican community. And we had some of the legendary Irish of Denver, the Mullins, and Mary Coyle Chase, our first Pulitzer Prize winner in writing, came to Casa Mayan, was a friend of the family. And it was a beautiful example of multiracial ethnic people coming together. We had African Americans like Ethel Waters, Marian Anderson, Paul Robeson, who were internationally respected as performers and artisans, but were not allowed to go to restaurants or hotels. And they were accepted into our community of Auraria. And this is important when we talk about cultural preservation. I may segue into the idea that even if Casa Mayan was not architecturally significant, which it is, we are now, thanks to the Denver Landmark Commission, Historic Denver, are proposing the La Alma Lincoln Park History Cultural District. The use of culture is what took place in the homes, the political movements, the social, the cultural, on top of the architecture. For many years, it was just the craftsmanship, which is to be respected, but now we recognize the formation of political movements, cultural clubs. We had writers and artisans from all over the world meet in these working class neighborhoods. And I'm glad after 50 years, we are recognizing the contributions of a community, not just its architectural imprint.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good point. We've been involved in that process and it's really moving forward. There's another community meeting, virtual community meeting on May 15th. That's open to the public at large. And then the plan is for it to go in front of City Council. So kind of a very exciting time for the La Alma Lincoln Park neighborhood. And I think, like Gregorio, like you said, like, I mean, I think we're getting hopefully to a place where there is a little bit more understanding about the cultural significance. And, you know, if you're familiar with Denver historic districts, sometimes they really need like one period of significance. And the other interesting piece about La Alma Lincoln Park is there's kind of two, like when the homes were built, but then 100 years later, they played an integral part of the Chicano rights movement. And so seeing the city come up with a way to like do a better job of reflecting that, I think is really exciting for future districts.
May I briefly add, just a side note here. This was not about Mexican Americans versus non-Mexicans in the planning department. What I'd like to emphasize briefly is we had proposals, and it's okay to talk about what it could have happened because that's part of the learning. We had proposals to save possibly 50 buildings. These would have been beautiful, strong industrial buildings, warehouses, scattered throughout Auraria. If this was incorporated into the campus, it would have been quite a unique place. We had professors who proposed that we could have a campus and still maintain a community, because the proposition was that this was going to be a community college, not an Ivy League college. And those people who proposed this, I think the difference between these professional planners and architects on one side and on the other that wanted to demolish everything was that they were engaged with the community. They walked, they went inside Casa Mayan, they met the people. They did not have plan views and just think of square footage. They recognized walking on the land, taking photographs, coming into these people's homes, and they had a different perspective. And today, I say that that is still an issue to be careful about when you deal with planners versus designers. Those that are actually take time to understand how people use the space, what they value, and walk into the space, not just deal with plans all the time and aerial views. That's very abstract, and sometimes it dehumanizes all those hundreds of people that value our space.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. Well, we're getting close to the end of our program, so I just want to remind anybody else that has questions, you can park them in the chat, you can unmute yourself and tell us about it there. I was gonna make one more little, well, I don't know if I've made that many. I was gonna make a plug for an opportunity to walk, like Gregorio was saying, to kind of like walk the streets if you're interested. We are offering a walking tour of Alamo Lincoln Park that'll include 9th Street this Saturday, the 8th at 10. And this is through a collaboration with History Colorado, because they have a new exhibit opening at the end of the month called Building Denver. So the tickets are available through their website, historycolorado.org, but it could be a fun opportunity to get a closer look at some of the structures that we've spoken about more virtually this evening. And then, are there any last questions or comments that folks want to leave us with as we kind of near the end of our program this evening? All right, well, I will mention, as we're kind of seeing if anything's coming in on the chat. We talked about this already, right? May 15th, if you're interested in tuning in and hearing how the Alamo Lincoln Park process is moving forward. And then one piece of Historic Denver's 50th anniversary that's happening right now is we are, you've seen a lot of the projects that we did in the past 50 years, but we're kind of looking ahead and thinking about, okay, what are the next 50 places that we need to be aware of? And we're crowdsourcing our list. So we're asking the community to go to our website and submit a place that they can't imagine Denver without, to help us understand where in the city maybe our efforts in the future should be organized. We're going to take all those community submissions. The site closes in mid-May, so you're almost out of time, but you can get them in. And then we're going to go through and come up with the action for that place to figure out for that particular structure, what is the most meaningful thing that we can do to help. So that will be kind of the focus of our work for the remainder of our kind of 50th year, is thinking about how do we make sure that we're aware of the places in Denver that matter to Denverites, and that we're helping citizens like we have in the past preserve those places in a meaningful way. So I did just want to point that out. The other really neat thing about the website for this is the submissions are live. So you can see what's already been submitted, which is really cool, just kind of getting a feel for places that people have submitted around Denver. I'll leave you with that piece. And then just a little teaser for 2 upcoming programs. We will have our next Empowered by Place. This is an every other month program that we offer at 7 p.m. And we're going to be talking about theaters. So on July 1st, we hope that you will join us. Because we're going to look at the history of Denver's blockbuster historic movie theaters, from the Mayan to the Lost Aladdin, and many others in between. So I hope you plan on joining us for that in July. A little bit sooner, later this month, a fun program called 1340 Penn. This is a virtual program, but they'll be talking about poisons, betrayals, and madness in the Victorian era, which sounds absolutely fascinating. And you can sign up for that at our website. And then we wanted an activity that got people out and exploring but still felt really safe. So we wrote a citywide scavenger hunt, and we're offering teams the opportunity to compete in June. You have 4 days for your team to complete our scavenger hunt, starting on June 17th, and we'll complete it on June 20th. You'll follow a series of clues that'll lead you to places in Denver, and that'll give you the opportunity to be there in person, feel safe with your team, but also learn a little bit more about Denver history. So just a few different ways to engage. And again, this, if you're interested, more information, you can find it on our website as well. So that brings us to the end of our program. Andre, did you have anything that you wanted to? Okay, perfect. I don't see any more questions or comments in the chat, so I'm gonna thank our speakers so much for being here this evening. As always, very informative and helped us understand the past and the present of our city in a way that I just don't think I had that understanding before. So thank you both so much for being here. And thank you guys, our audience, for bearing with us and hanging out for another very fun virtual program. We'll stick around for another minute if you do have questions you'd prefer to ask individually.